Total War over the years has become the biggest and perhaps most successful strategy gaming franchise of all time. Starting off with Medieval and Shogun in the early 2000s, moving up to big advances in Napoleon and Empire, then the infamous Rome 2 that started off as well, a bit of a buggy disaster, but becoming one of the best Total War games in the franchise in many people's opinions. Then we get later on into the IP. Games like Thrones of Britannia had some controversy with being a smaller game and perhaps not really having the prowess of some of their others. Three Kingdoms really going away from the historical into mythical and then totally being overtaken by Warhammer. Now, Creative Assembly's franchise as a whole has had some controversy, but none perhaps bigger than the naval warfare. See, it used to be a massive part of some of the mid games in the franchise, the Empires, the Romes, the Shoguns, but it started to go away. And in today's video, I'm going to be going over why. How did they start and how did it finish? Why Creative Assembly made the creative decision in order to depart from those naval warfare battles and what effect this had on the later franchise. I want to give a quick shout out to Republic of Play, as he made a video a few years ago on the history of Total War naval battles. It goes incredibly in depth about everything you need to know about ship battles from the first to the last of the Total Wars, and I've used pieces of that to help research this video. However, I will be focusing on the reasons that naval battles died rather than the evolution of each of them. More of why the game mode stopped rather than how it came to be. When anyone says naval battles, I think the first thing that comes to a Total War gamer's mind is the word buggy. They are famously buggy, especially in a game like Rome 2 Total War, where they featured in a massive way. But where did they start? Well, Empire and Napoleon had some great naval battles. These weren't quite as buggy as something we saw in Rome 2, and perhaps that was down to the gunpowder gameplay that I'll talk about in a little bit later. You see, they first came around in Empire Total War. This was the introduction of the completely new engine from Creative Assembly called Warscape. This new engine was set to be taking the Total War franchise to the next level, something way bigger than we'd ever had before, and it is still used to this day, so obviously something is working that Creative Assembly think it's worth keeping in. And the new implementation of the Warscape engine perhaps gave Creative Assembly the ability to introduce naval battles into the franchise, but as I mentioned, that same Warscape engine is still being used to this day. So not only was it the catalyst to introduce naval battles to the Total War franchise, but perhaps it was also the downfall of ships in Total War. You see, the main issues that have arose from the Warscape engine are collisions. We saw this a lot on the release of Rome 2. It was hidden pretty well in games that came before with Empire and Napoleon, mostly having musket-based combat, with armies firing volleys from across the maps, using artillery and cannons in order to take out the enemy team, and only charging into melee as a last resort, or on the back of horses. But in Rome 2, it was much harder to hide these faults. Larger armies were clashing, all in hand-to-hand combat. It was a mainstay of this ancient warfare, but we saw rubber banding, and it became a real issue because of this Warscape engine and the collision detection that was in it. I think Angry Joe sums it up pretty well in his very famous review that he made back in 2013.
Generals in the time period won and lost through formations and discipline. But you can't do that shit on default, as unit collision is completely fucked in this game. Instead, troops ball up, just ignoring all the years of training and just run into each other like idiots. Just all-out brawls, no discipline whatsoever.
But this was the first time the new engine had been stretched and tested with real, proper hardcore melee combat, and it didn't seem to fare too well. And all this translated into the naval combat as well, as ship battles went from the use of musket and cannons in Empire, Napoleon, and even Shogun to some extent, to boarding and ramming actions and melee combat in the likes of Rome 2. And this is where the cracks in this engine really started to show, and perhaps more in these infantry engagements. Melee fighting on a smaller scale with individual troops on land seemed easy enough to patch, and this was later brought into Rome 2, making Rome 2 the game it is today. However, the ship combat probably less so. Don't get me wrong, CA have done a fantastic job with the resurrection for Total War Rome 2, and it's one of my favourite games now. However, whilst the naval combat has got better over the years, it still isn't perfect, and I think it was perhaps a step too far for the engine to handle with the current state of collision detection. Rome 2 was also the introduction of combined naval and land battles, defending cities and points with enemies and troops on land with you, but also out in the oceans, fighting on ships and then landing in order to help their allies on the shore. But with this massive new mechanic that was introduced into Rome 2, it made it way harder for the AI to be as effective as they were normally, as landing was incredibly buggy. AI have never really been Total War's strong point, and adding in a completely new and foreign action for them to do in the missed a battle seemed just a little too much for it to handle. Now, Rome 2 wasn't officially the end of naval battles in Total War. It came back in Attila, but it was fairly similar to what we'd seen in the 2013 sequel. And whilst it came back in games like Thrones of Britannia, in terms of an official campaign naval battle with dedicated fleets, Attila really kind of was the end. Later, it did turn into transport ship battles, but that kind of added very little to the actual gameplay and the reasons to build up a fleet within your campaign. Then, in Three Kingdoms, we officially saw the death of all ship and naval battle content. And from then on, the Warhammer games introduced just auto-resolving battles, which I think is a massive shame, since seeing these Warhammer fleets would have been something completely new and an absolute incredible sight to see, using all the different factions and the technology that they have within this Total War game. But it seems now Creative Assembly try and rush out a game every year, or even at this rate, a couple of years, and it's not really enough time to make the masterpiece that I think everyone remembers the Total War games for being. Content gets cut, and I think naval battles were just one of those things. I mean, look at the detail in a game like Empire Total War. Look at the ship battles. They look absolutely gorgeous, with bits flying off every bit of naval vessel, with troops all doing their own thing within the battles. But since Rome 2 and Attila, and yes, they pulled it off in the end, but the hassle they probably went through to get there, I'm not sure CA wanted to spend that much time on these individual games anymore. Maybe this is down to investors or shareholders who really are the customers. They need the games every year or every few years, so CA need to get their games out on time. And putting a massive thing like naval combat and perfecting it to the level that it needs to be a really decent and solid game mode, maybe there just isn't the resources for that sort of thing. Bringing out a game every year is way more profitable for the company, but unfortunately it does mean that we do see much lower quality and of course much less content within the game. So it's completely down to Creative Assembly not bothering or wanting to put the resources in, right? Well, no. I think that's a little bit harsh. A lot of fans have also shared their opinions and they seem to not really care about naval battles. Well, personally, I disagree with that, and I'd love for them to make a return. I think there's so many possibilities, especially with future games in fantasy having naval battles combined with land battles. Many fans that I've seen on forums and dedicated reviews just want the resources that CA have to go into these land battles, to go into the mainstay of Total War. And admittedly, yes, that is the core of the franchise, and naval battles do take up a massive amount of effort for development, but it is a shame to see them go completely. CA have said that in more recent games that they just kind of disregarded naval battles completely. They said with Three Kingdoms and Troy that they didn't really think that they needed them, and the history of the period and the target they were going for didn't have that many naval battles to speak of, which they wanted to recreate. Now, I'm not sure how accurate that is. I think it mostly just comes down to time, resources, and a need to release a game annually. And I know we've had a bit of a break since Troy and the slowing of Warhammer 3's release, but I would love CA to go back and spend some time crafting a new game, maybe taking a few years out, almost resetting the franchise and straying away from that conveyor belt of decent but not incredible Total War games that they've seemed to be on for the last 5 years. The Total War franchise is so unique, and it has that possibility to be so much bigger than it is. Whilst it is the biggest strategy franchise, I think there's still a lot of wasted potential because CA just trying to get out as many games as possible. And things like naval battles, whilst it is mainly a talking point for this video, it is a look into a bigger picture. The fact that there's new features that are possible to get into games like this, but whether it's time, resources, or issues with the current engine, they seem to be put to the wayside because it isn't the formulaic thing to do. But please let me know what you think. Do you want to see the return of naval battles in the Total War franchise, and what do you think is the true downfall to why they were taken out in the first place? I know I said a lot of people that I've seen don't really care about the naval battles, but like me, I know there's probably some people out there that really want to see them back again. So make sure you leave a comment down below and I'll be sure to check up on them. Leave a like on the video, however, if you enjoyed it. Leave a dislike if you didn't. And I cannot wait for the next Total War game. So until then, I will see you in the next one.